Jeff with Blue Collar BI. Today I'm going to be talking about a way that I've started using parameters that I think is really useful and worth sharing. So I had a client and they were interested in being able to look at a scatter plot across time and be able to differentiate between a selected client and a group of retailers. And so the x-axis represents the vintage year for wine production. Each blue dot here in the vintage year represents a different retailer. And they wanted to be able to select one particular retailer, say Classic Wines, as a client and have Classic Wines show up in each one of these groupings of retailers. And at first I thought it'd be easy. I thought I could use some kind of functional uh, way to get different colors or just rely on conditional formatting. But in fact, in a scatter plot, there really is no easy way to use conditional formatting. So you come to markers and you can select individual colors for the different retailers, but you can't get any type of conditional or functional coloration. So I was really stumped, and then I just started fooling around with parameters. And so the use case here was to look at two fact tables. So the first fact table is competitor sales, which is what we're looking at here, where we want to be able to differentiate the selected client from the other competitors. The second use case was within client sales to limit this to just a single client. So the objectives were use a scatter chart to highlight a selected client compared to a group of competitors. In Power Query, create a parameter from an imported fact table. In this instance, the table was coming from SQL. And then use that parameter for two purposes. One was to filter to a single customer in a sales table. The second is to use the same parameter to indicate which customer has been selected compared to the group of competitors. So this is what I was trying to do. Let me show you how I got it done. I come to transform data and we'll come up and we'll see four tables here, two dimension tables, dim wines and dim vintage, and then the two fact tables, competitor sales and client sales. So in order to create the parameter, I wanted to have a live connection back to the SQL database as customers were added or taken off. And I just couldn't figure out a good way to do that. So the first way to start it was just to get a list of customers. So to do that, I'm going to duplicate the client sales table, then highlight and remove all the other columns. Okay, then remove duplicates and sort alphabetically. Okay, so then I have this table that I'm going to call client list. So I thought I had this list and I wanted to use this list as a parameter, but when it comes to manage parameters and being able to just use this in this format, it wasn't possible. So suggested values, you have any value, you can have a list of values or a query. This looks like a list to me, but in fact it wasn't. I could have exported this to Excel and then pasted it back in as a list, but that wouldn't have achieved my objective of maintaining a live connection back to the SQL DB, or I could use a query. And so then I searched for how do I create a query from a table in Power Query, and there were no good answers to be found on YouTube or anywhere on the web. So I really struggled with this. I finally just started trying stuff. And so what I tried was to add as new query. I finally got to this, the last item on this list. And when I did this, it created a list for me. So now I finally had this list and I hoped I would be able to create the parameter. So come back to the home tab, come to new parameter. And I knew this was text. So let's call this select client. And then type would be text and then suggested values. So I went to list of values, but there was nothing here that was showing up as this retailer list. So I switched and tried query and open query, and there's retailer, and that looks to be the same thing. And so then I said current value, let's choose Classic Wines, and that is the created parameter, but it wasn't straightforward at all. to figure that out. But now I had the parameter and now I could use it in the way I wanted. So the first way was to filter the client sales table to only show the selected client. So I'm going to come to retailer, to text filters equals, and then in the interface, instead of ABC, you use parameter, select client, OK, and retailer is now classic wines and only classic wines. The second thing was to, in competitor sales, find some way to mark classic wines as the selected client. And so what I ended up doing was coming back to this client list table, adding a column, an index column with just one. So starting index is 1, we have 0 as the increment. So now we have index, and then I'm going to filter this table in exactly the same way that I filtered the client sales table. So come to retailer, text filters equals, parameter, select client, and now we have classic wines with an index value of 1. And let's change this to is selected. And then in competitor sales, I'm going to do a merge between the client list, which I won't need to see in Power BI, and competitor sales. So come to competitor sales, merge queries with join on retailer. And so you see it's going to bring in 170 of 1114 rows. Click OK. And so now I have this new column client list. When I expand it, I only want is selected and I don't need the original column name as a prefix. So now we have is selected. And if I look, we have two values, 1 and null. Let's do a sort descending. So we have the 1 next to classic wines. Second column would be, so now I want to designate a classic wines versus other column. So then we're going to have a conditional column using is selected. So we're going to say client versus other. So if is selected equals 1, then client, let me go back and change that, else other. Okay, and let's get the drop down and see. So we have client and other. The next conditional column will be very similar. So this will be client retailer. If column name is selected equals 1, then client, else select a column, and the column is retailer. Click OK. And we have client, classic wine, in the place of classic wines, and then all of the other retailers here. So that's exactly what I wanted. So now I'm going to change the type to text. And then hit close and apply, and I'm going to bring this new data down into Power BI. Okay, so the data has been downloaded, and when we come to the client table, we see classic wines and only classic wines in this retailer list. So that's exactly what we wanted. And then on the retailers page, we still see these same dots here, and that's because the legend is retailer. So I'm going to switch the legend to client and retailer and take out retailer. And when I do that, now we have Bob's Wine Store, then client, then Falstaff Wines, Madrona Cellars, Pine and Eastern, and dark blue is differentiating, that's client. So I'm just going to change the color to make it easier to differentiate from that blue. So we'll change client to yellow. Okay? And so now my selected client, Classic Wines, is really standing out compared to the other retailers. And when I switch clients, so transform data, edit parameters, instead of Classic Wines, we'll choose Pine and Eastern, click OK. And when I apply the changes, it's going to send the parameter selection back up into Power Query, make those changes for me, and watch the jump in the bubbles as they move to their new positions. That's on the retailers page, and then on the client page, we have Pine and Eastern. So this is working exactly the way I wanted, and I just thought it was really cool how we were able to use parameters in a way that I think is not very commonly used, but is certainly very useful. Hope this was useful for you. Thanks, and please subscribe.